The tunnel entrance was barely visible beneath 2 feet of fresh snow, but Thomas Garrett crawled through it anyway, dragging his loaded sledge behind him. Above ground, the blizzard that had already killed 3 men in the surrounding valleys howled into its 6th day. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The blizzard hit the Montana Rockies on January 9, 1842, 3 hours after sunset. Thomas Garrett and Henry Paulson were checking their trap lines when the first snow began falling. They made it back to their cabin just as visibility dropped to nothing. Neither man was particularly worried. They had weathered storms before. The cabin was solid, their firewood supply was adequate, and they had plenty of food. What they didn't know was that this storm would last 4 days and teach Thomas a lesson that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cabin they shared was typical of mountain trapper construction. Notched log walls, mud chinking, a single door, one small window covered with oiled rawhide, and a crude stone fireplace. They had built it together the previous summer in 5 days. Inside, they kept perhaps 3 days' worth of split firewood stacked against the wall near the hearth. Their main supply, enough for the entire winter, was stored in a simple lean-to structure 20 feet from the cabin door. 20 feet that might as well have been 20 miles once the storm truly began. Day 1 was manageable. The snow fell steadily but not dramatically. Thomas and Henry played cards, maintained the fire, and told stories they had already shared a dozen times. They weren't concerned about firewood yet. The indoor supply would last another 2 days at least. Day 2 brought heavier snow and wind that drove the flakes horizontally across the landscape. Drifts began building against the cabin. Walls. The door became difficult to open against the accumulating pressure. They cracked it once at midday to assess conditions and immediately forced it shut again. The wind was strong enough to rip the door from their hands. Snow poured into the cabin in the few seconds the door was open. By day 3, their indoor firewood was gone. The temperature inside the cabin hovered just above freezing, even with both men wrapped in buffalo robes near the dying coals. They faced the choice every mountain man dreaded. Stay inside and freeze, or brave the storm to reach the woodshed. Henry volunteered. He was younger, stronger, and convinced he could make the journey. Thomas helped him prepare. They tied a rope around Henry's waist and secured the other end to the door frame. The rope was 30 feet long, more than enough to reach the woodshed and return. Henry wrapped himself in every piece of extra clothing they owned, pulled a wool scarf across his face, and pushed open the door. The wind nearly knocked him down immediately. Snow had drifted 4 feet high against the cabin. Henry fought through it, disappearing into the whiteout within seconds. Thomas closed the door to prevent heat loss and waited, holding the rope. It remained taut for several minutes, then went slack. Thomas waited 10 minutes, 15, 20. He pulled the rope back. The knot had come undone. Henry was gone. When dawn came on day 4, the storm had weakened. Thomas forced the door open and found Henry 15 feet from the cabin, frozen solid, facing the wrong direction. Thomas buried Henry Paulson on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had trapped together for 2 seasons. The ground was frozen solid. It took him 3 days to dig a grave deep enough, using fire to soften the earth and a pickaxe to break through the frost. He marked the site with stones and stood there for a long time, not praying exactly, but thinking. Henry had died 20 feet from safety, 20 feet from enough firewood to keep them both alive. The distance a man could walk in 5 seconds under normal conditions had become an impossible journey in a blizzard. Spring came slowly to the mountains that year. Thomas completed the trapping season alone, working the lines they had set together, processing pelts in a cabin that felt too large for one person. But his mind wasn't on beaver anymore. He kept returning to the same problem. How do you access firewood during a storm severe enough to make surface travel fatal? The question consumed him during long evenings alone. He started sketching plans on pieces of birch bark using charcoal from the fire. Most mountain men would have accepted Henry's death as simply bad luck, the cost of living in harsh country. Thomas couldn't let it go. He began visiting other trappers in the region, asking questions about their cabins and winter survival strategies. Most kept 3 to 5 days of firewood inside their living spaces. Some built attached lean-to structures with interior doors, eliminating the need to go outside. But attached woodsheds shared a wall with the cabin, creating serious fire risk. One stray spark, one overheated stovepipe, and your entire fuel supply could burn. Thomas had seen it happen. A trapper named William Carswell had lost half his winter wood to a fire that started in an attached shed 2 years earlier. The more Thomas thought about the problem, the more he realized that conventional solutions were inadequate. Storing wood inside limited capacity and created hazards. Attached structures reduced exposure but increased fire risk. Detached woodsheds were safer but became unreachable in severe weather. There had to be another approach, something no one had tried because it seemed too difficult or too strange. That's when Thomas remembered working in a Kentucky coal mine as a young man before he came west. Miners moved underground through passages that remained accessible regardless of surface weather. Tunnels didn't drift shut. Snow and wind couldn't block them. The idea seemed absurd at first. Dig a tunnel from your cabin to your woodshed? The labor involved would be enormous. The engineering challenges were significant. Other trappers would think he had lost his mind, but Thomas kept refining the concept. A passage below ground level, supported with timbers connecting the cabin to a protected wood storage area. You could haul firewood in any weather without ever stepping outside. No exposure, no wind, no whiteout conditions turning you around. The more he developed the idea, the more convinced he became that it could work. By the time he left the mountains in June to sell his furs, Thomas had decided exactly what he was going to build. Thomas returned to the mountains in late June 1843 with unusual supplies. Most trappers came back with basic goods: powder, lead, coffee, and salt. Thomas brought shovels, rope, canvas, iron brackets, and a specialized draw knife. He also brought something intangible but equally important, a complete plan for what he intended to build. He selected a new location for his cabin, a slight rise with good drainage and clear sight lines. Then he did something that baffled every trapper who saw him. He started digging before he built anything. The excavation took 3 weeks. Thomas marked out a trench 20 feet long, 3 feet wide, running from where his cabin foundation would be to where he planned to construct his woodshed. He dug down 2.5 feet below the surface, removing rocks and roots, creating a level floor with a slight upward grade toward the woodshed end. Neighbors who passed by stopped to watch, confused by what they were seeing. Jacob Brennan, an experienced trapper with 9 winters in the mountains, was the first to openly mock the effort. "You building a cabin or a mine shaft, Garrett?" Brennan asked, standing at the edge of the trench while Thomas worked below. "Man doesn't need to dig to China just to have a place to sleep." Thomas didn't stop working. "It's not for sleeping. It's for staying alive when the weather turns bad." "Weather turns bad. You stay inside like everyone else," Brennan replied. "You're wasting time that should go toward getting ready for winter." William Carswell visited a week later and offered similar observations. "I've built 4 cabins in these mountains, Garrett. Not one of them required digging a ditch first. You trying to make trapping more complicated than it needs to be?" Samuel Reed, a younger trapper who had only 2 seasons of experience, made jokes that spread through the small, scattered community of mountain men in the region. "Garrett's digging his way back to civilization," Reed told others. "Figures if he tunnels east long enough, he'll come up in street." Louis. Thomas ignored all of it. He continued working, installing support structures made from flexible willow saplings bent into arched shapes and secured with rope. He laid split planks across the arches, creating a curved ceiling that would distribute weight more effectively than a flat surface. Over the planks, he stretched canvas and then shoveled earth back into place, creating a covered passage. He left openings at both ends and installed a ventilation shaft at the midpoint. The entire tunnel structure took 5 weeks to complete, and that was before he even started building the cabin itself. By late August, when Thomas finally began raising cabin walls using techniques similar to those other trappers employed, his neighbors had stopped visiting. They had concluded that grief over Henry's death had affected his judgment. The general consensus was that Thomas Garrett was wasting an entire summer on elaborate construction that served no practical purpose. He would realize his mistake when winter came, and he was underprepared. The tunnel system Thomas built that summer represented a fundamental rethinking of frontier shelter design. Where most trappers focused solely on the cabin itself, Thomas designed his living space and supply access as an integrated system. The tunnel ran 22 feet from the cabin's foundation to a semi-subterranean woodshed he constructed specifically to work with the underground passage. Every element served multiple purposes, and every detail reflected lessons he had learned from Henry's death. The tunnel entrance inside the cabin was positioned at floor level in the corner farthest from the fireplace. Thomas built a wooden frame around the opening and installed a heavy canvas flap mounted on the interior side. This first barrier could be secured with wooden pegs, creating a seal when the tunnel wasn't in use. The tunnel itself maintained a height of 2.5 feet and a width of 3 feet throughout its length. Thomas had calculated these dimensions carefully. Too small and moving through it would be difficult. Too large, and the excavation would take twice as long and require more support materials. The arched ceiling structure was perhaps the most sophisticated element. Thomas had shaped green willow saplings into curved ribs spaced every 3 feet along the tunnel's length. These arches transferred the weight of earth and snow above laterally to the tunnel walls rather than concentrating pressure at the center. The physics were sound, borrowed from stone bridge construction, but adapted for underground passage. Split planks laid over the arches created a continuous ceiling surface. Canvas stretched over the planks provided a moisture barrier, and 18 inches of packed earth above everything completed the structure. The floor sloped upward at a gentle grade from the cabin end toward the woodshed, rising approximately 4 inches over the tunnel's length. This reverse pitch meant any water entering from either end would flow back out rather than accumulating in the passage. Thomas had dug drainage trenches around the tunnel's perimeter 6 inches deeper than the floor level, directing groundwater away from the structure. Near both entrances, he laid gravel to absorb minor moisture and prevent mud formation. At the tunnel's midpoint, Thomas installed a ventilation shaft. A 6-inch diameter tube made from hollowed logs extended from the tunnel ceiling to 4 feet above ground surface. This shaft would allow air circulation during extended use without creating significant heat loss. Thomas planned to build a conical snow chimney around the shaft, opening each winter, maintaining airflow while protecting the opening from being buried. The woodshed at the tunnel's terminus was built partially underground, with walls extending 3 feet below surface level. Only the roof and upper 2 feet of walls were visible above ground. The structure measured 8 feet by 10 feet internally and could hold 6 cords of split firewood. 3 walls were solid log construction, fully chinked and weatherproof. The 4th wall, facing away from prevailing winds, remained open for air circulation to season the wood and prevent rot. The tunnel opened into the woodshed floor, allowing Thomas to access his fuel supply without using the exterior door. Thomas completed his cabin and tunnel system in early October 1843. The structure was solid, the tunnel functioned exactly as designed, and his woodshed was fully stocked with seasoned firewood. He had accomplished what he set out to do, but the validation he sought remained theoretical. The tunnel worked in fair weather. Whether it would prove its worth during a severe storm was still unknown. As autumn progressed and no major weather events materialized, Thomas began to wonder if he had spent an entire summer solving a problem that might never occur again. In late October, Thomas traveled to a small settlement 30 miles east to purchase winter supplies. There he met Catherine Warner, a widow whose husband had died the previous spring in a logging accident. Catherine was 40, 2 years old, practical-minded, and facing a difficult winter alone. Thomas was 43 and tired of solitary living after a season spent working through grief. They married within 2 weeks of meeting, a frontier courtship based more on practical necessity than romance, though mutual respect and compatibility developed quickly. Catherine moved to Thomas's cabin in early November. Her first question upon arrival was about the strange opening at floor level in the corner. Thomas explained the tunnel system, walking her through the passage to show her the woodshed. Catherine listened carefully, examined the construction, and acknowledged the engineering skill involved. But her response was measured. "It's well built, Thomas. I can see you put considerable thought into this. But it seems like an enormous amount of work for something that might never be necessary." "Henry Paulson died 20 feet from his woodshed," Thomas replied. "If we had a tunnel like this, he'd still be alive." Catherine touched his arm gently. "I understand why you built it. I'm not saying it was wrong. I'm just saying I hope we never need it badly enough to prove it was right." That sentiment was echoed throughout the scattered trapping community. Samuel Reed visited in late November and made his usual jokes. "Built yourself an escape tunnel for when your wife gets angry, did you, Garrett? That's forward thinking. Most men just head to the woods, but you've got a proper underground route planned." Jacob Brennan stopped by in early December and was more direct. "You spent a whole summer digging, Garrett. A whole summer you could have used for trapping, hunting, or building up supplies, and for what? A hole in the ground you'll probably never use." That's the problem with book learning and fancy ideas. Sometimes the old ways work because they're good enough. Winter arrived without drama. November brought light snows and cold temperatures, but nothing exceptional. December was actually milder than usual. By early January 1844, Thomas's tunnel remained an unused curiosity, an elaborate solution to a problem that seemed increasingly unlikely to recur. The consensus among his neighbors was clear. Garrett had wasted his effort on an innovation nobody needed. The weather turned on January 15, 1844. Thomas woke to a temperature drop so severe he could see his breath inside the cabin, despite a fire burning through the night. The sky was dark gray, low clouds moving fast from the northwest. He had seen weather like this before, the kind that preceded serious storms. By mid-morning, snow began falling. Light at first, then steadily heavier as the day progressed. By evening, 6 inches covered the ground, and the wind had picked up significantly. Day 2 brought conditions that old-timers in the region would later describe as unprecedented. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to a few feet. Wind drove the snow horizontally, creating drifts that built with alarming speed. Thomas checked the tunnel entrance inside the cabin and found it secure. He crawled through to the woodshed, loaded his newly built cargo sledge with split logs, and hauled the day's fuel supply back through the passage. The trip took 10 minutes. Above ground, the storm raged with intensity that made surface travel impossible. Day 3. The storm didn't weaken. If anything, it intensified. Snow accumulation reached 3 feet on level ground and 6 feet where drifts formed against structures. Thomas made another tunnel trip for Firewood. Catherine watched him crawl into the passage and return safely minutes later. She was beginning to understand why he had built this system. Outside their cabin, neighbors were facing increasingly serious situations. Marcus Webb, a trapper whose cabin was a mile south, discovered his door was frozen shut from ice buildup and exterior snow pressure. He spent an hour chipping ice and forcing the door open enough to assess conditions, only to realize that reaching his woodshed was impossible. Day 4 brought desperation for those without protected fuel access. Daniel Frost attempted to reach his woodpile, located 30 feet from his cabin. He tied a rope around his waist and fought through waist-deep snow, wind strong enough to knock him down repeatedly. He made it to the woodshed, grabbed an armload of logs, and barely found his way back by following the rope. He suffered frostbite on 3 fingers and both ears during the 15-minute ordeal. He knew he couldn't make that journey again. Day 5. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Jacob Brennan's family began burning furniture to supplement their dwindling firewood. William Carswell rationed his remaining logs, keeping only enough fire to prevent freezing while wearing every piece of clothing he owned. Samuel Reed broke apart his spare snowshoes and a wooden chair to feed his fire. Throughout the scattered community of trappers and settlers, people faced calculations about survival. How many logs remained? How many days could the storm possibly last? What would they burn when the wood ran out? Thomas crawled through his tunnel 3 times on day 5, maintaining a warm cabin while the worst blizzard in living memory buried the Rocky Mountain landscape under snow that kept falling with relentless, deadly persistence. Day 6 of the blizzard arrived with no change in conditions. Thomas woke before dawn, added logs to the fire from the supply he had hauled the previous evening, and prepared breakfast while Catherine stayed wrapped in blankets. The cabin interior remained comfortably warm, somewhere around 50 degrees, despite the savage cold outside. Through the small window, nothing was visible except swirling snow. The world had disappeared into white chaos. After breakfast, Thomas lit a candle and approached the tunnel entrance. He pulled back the canvas flap and crawled into the passage, dragging his empty sledge behind him. The tunnel was dark, cold, but completely protected from the storm raging above. His breath formed clouds in the candlelight as he moved forward, pulling himself along with his elbows while pushing the sledge ahead. The journey took about 5 minutes. When he reached the woodshed end, he emerged into the semi-subterranean structure where his firewood remained dry and accessible. He loaded the sledge with split logs, extinguished the candle to preserve it, and made the return trip in darkness, navigating by feel and memory. 10 minutes after entering the tunnel, Thomas was back inside the warm cabin with enough firewood to last another 8 hours. He made this trip 3 times throughout day 6. Each journey was cold and uncomfortable, crawling through cramped darkness, but compared to what his neighbors were enduring, it was effortless. A mile south, Marcus Webb's family huddled together under every blanket they owned. Their fire had died completely on day 5. Webb had attempted to force his door open on day 6 to reach his woodshed, but couldn't budge it against the massive snowdrift that had built against the exterior. The door was effectively sealed. His wife and 2 children were dressed in layers of clothing, shivering despite their efforts to stay warm. Webb burned the last of his furniture, a small table that provided perhaps 2 hours of heat. After that, they had nothing left to burn. Daniel Frost sat alone in his cabin, his frost-bitten fingers wrapped in cloth, unable to grip anything properly. His firewood supply had run out on day 5. He had broken apart everything wooden that wasn't structural, feeding chair legs and shelf boards into his fireplace to maintain minimal heat. He knew he was in serious trouble. The cold was winning. His body had stopped shivering, which he recognized as a dangerous sign. Without more fuel, he would not survive another night. Jacob Brennan's situation was marginally better, but declining rapidly. He had perhaps 6 logs remaining. His family of 4 rationed the fire carefully, keeping only enough flame to prevent the cabin interior from dropping below freezing. Everyone wore multiple layers and stayed wrapped in buffalo robes. They were surviving, but barely. Brennan had built cabins in these mountains for nearly a decade. He had always considered his methods adequate. Now he understood the difference between adequate and prepared. The storm broke on the morning of day 9. Thomas woke to silence, the absence of wind so profound it seemed unnatural after more than a week of constant howling. He opened the cabin door carefully, pushing against snow that had drifted partway up the frame. Sunlight reflected off a landscape transformed into something alien. Snow covered everything in smooth, sculpted drifts that reached 8 feet in places. The world was white, silent, and devastatingly beautiful. Thomas spent the morning clearing a path from his door, shoveling through snow that was chest-deep on level ground and over his head where drifts had formed. Other trappers throughout the region were doing the same, emerging from their cabins to assess damage and, in some cases, to check on neighbors who might not have survived. Marcus Webb finally managed to force his door open around midday. He and his family had survived, but barely. They had spent the final 3 days without fire, huddled together for warmth in temperatures cold enough to kill. His children were hypothermic, but alive. Daniel Frost was found by William Carswell late in the afternoon. Frost had survived by wrapping himself in every hide and blanket he owned and staying completely still to conserve body heat. His cabin interior was barely above freezing. He had frostbite damage on 8 fingers and both feet. Carswell helped him to a neighbor's cabin where a fire could be built using borrowed wood. 3 trappers in distant valleys were not as fortunate. Word would spread over the following weeks about men who had frozen when their fuel ran out and no rescue was possible through the storm. By the second day after the storm, enough paths had been cleared that neighbors could visit one another. That's when they saw something that didn't make sense. Smoke rising steadily from Thomas Garrett's chimney. Not the desperate, intermittent smoke of rationed fuel, but the consistent output of a cabin that had stayed warm throughout the entire blizzard. Jacob Brennan trudged through the snow to investigate, bringing Samuel Reed with him. They found Thomas outside, splitting more firewood, looking no worse for wear than if he had spent a pleasant week indoors. "How much wood did you have stored inside?" Brennan asked, confused by what he was seeing. "Same as always. 3 days' worth," Thomas replied. "That's impossible. The storm lasted 9 days. You couldn't have reached your woodshed. Nobody could." Thomas set down his axe. "I didn't need to reach it by walking." He led them around the cabin to where the tunnel entrance was barely visible beneath the massive snow accumulation. Using a shovel, he cleared the entrance enough to reveal the opening. Then he crawled inside and disappeared. 30 seconds later, he emerged from the woodshed 20 feet away, carrying an armload of split logs. Brennan and Reed stood in silence, understanding finally dawning. The tunnel they had mocked all summer had kept Thomas and Catherine alive, while others froze. The innovation they had dismissed as excessive had proven itself in the most dramatic way possible. Within 2 weeks of the great blizzard, every trapper within 30 miles had heard about Thomas Garrett's tunnel. The story spread through the scattered mountain community with remarkable speed, carried by men who had nearly frozen and now understood exactly what Thomas had built and why it mattered. The skepticism that had dominated reactions to his construction project evaporated completely. What had seemed like excessive effort in summer looked like brilliant foresight after 9 days of desperate cold. Robert Haywood was the first to ask for help. He arrived at Thomas's cabin in early February with a simple request: "Teach me how to build one." Haywood was an experienced trapper, competent and practical, not given to adopting new methods without good reason. But he had spent the final 3 days of the blizzard burning furniture while his children cried from cold. He never wanted to face that situation again. Thomas agreed immediately. They spent a week discussing design principles, material requirements, and construction techniques. Thomas drew diagrams on birch bark, explaining the importance of proper depth, drainage, support structures, and entrance positioning. By spring, Haywood had selected a new cabin site and begun excavation. His tunnel design followed Thomas's specifications closely, but incorporated a few modifications based on his specific location and available materials. He used pine logs instead of willow for his arch supports, and positioned his woodshed slightly differently to account for prevailing wind patterns in his valley. The core principles remained the same: protected underground passage, proper support structure, sufficient depth to stay below drift accumulation, and careful attention to drainage. Isaac Thornton operated a small trading post that served trappers throughout the region. Every man who came through that spring wanted to talk about the blizzard, and inevitably, the conversation turned to Thomas Garrett's tunnel. Thornton, recognizing the significance of what he was hearing, began describing the technique to every trapper who passed through. He didn't have complete technical knowledge, but he understood the basic concept well enough to explain it. Word spread beyond the immediate area. Trappers heading to other regions carried the story with them. Some dismissed it as exaggerated frontier legend. Others recognized it as genuine innovation worth investigating. James Coulter, a trapper who kept detailed journals of his mountain experiences, documented the tunnel technique in an entry dated April 20th, 1844. His description was precise and technical, including measurements, material specifications, and construction sequence. Coulter's journals would eventually be read by historians studying frontier life, preserving Thomas's innovation in written form decades after the man himself had been forgotten by most. By summer of 1844, 5 more tunnel cabins were under construction across the Montana and Wyoming territories. Not every trapper adopted the technique. Some still considered it too much work for a problem that might only occur once in a lifetime. Others lacked the engineering knowledge or physical capability to excavate and support an underground passage. But those who had faced the great blizzard became believers and advocates. Jacob Brennan, who had mocked Thomas so openly the previous year, began building his own tunnel in June. When asked about his change of perspective, his response was simple and direct. "I'd rather spend a summer digging than spend another winter wondering if my children will freeze." Thomas and Catherine Garrett raised 3 children in the tunnel cabin over the following 2 decades. The structure served them through 18 winters, including 2 more severe storms that validated Thomas's design principles. The tunnel required minimal maintenance, occasional replacement of support timbers as wood aged, and annual clearing of the ventilation shaft. But the core system remained functional year after year, providing protected access to fuel supplies regardless of surface weather conditions. The cabin became known throughout the region simply as the Garrett Place, and trappers passing through would often detour to see the famous tunnel for themselves. In 1865, Thomas and Catherine moved to lower elevation. Their children were grown, the fur trade had long since collapsed, and Thomas was 65 years old, too old for mountain winters. They sold the property to a younger family who recognized the value of what Thomas had built. The cabin and tunnel system continued serving new inhabitants for another 15 years. When the structure was finally abandoned in the early 1880s, it wasn't due to structural failure, but simply because the region's population had shifted and better locations had become available. The technique Thomas developed spread throughout high-elevation settlements across the Rocky Mountains during the 1840s and 1850s. Variations appeared based on local conditions, available materials, and individual skill levels. Some builders created shorter tunnels connecting to attached but fire-separated woodsheds. Others extended the concept, building tunnels to root cellars that also stored firewood. A few ambitious settlers created multiple tunnel systems connecting various outbuildings to their main cabins. The specific implementations varied, but they all derived from the same core innovation Thomas had developed in response to Henry Paulson's death. Historical records from the period are incomplete, but accounts suggest that tunnel cabin systems saved dozens of lives over the following decades. Severe winter storms occurred irregularly, but inevitably, in the high Rockies. Each time conditions turned deadly, those with protected fuel access survived, while others faced crisis. The innovation's value wasn't in daily convenience, but in catastrophic weather insurance. Most winters, the tunnel seemed like unnecessary luxury. But in the winters that mattered, it meant the difference between survival and death. Thomas Garrett died in 1879, at age 79, in a small house near Missoula, Montana. His obituary made no mention of the tunnel innovation or his years as a mountain man. To the community that knew him in his final years, he was simply a retired trapper who had lived a long, unremarkable life. But in the mountains he had left behind, cabins built using his method still stood. Their tunnels, hidden beneath surface snow each winter, continued providing exactly what Thomas had designed them to provide: a way to stay alive when the world above became impossible to navigate. The innovation had outlived its inventor, carved not in stone or written in books, but built into earth and timber, waiting beneath the snow.